Welcome to Petronoia, the podcast that cuts through the noise of the energy debate. Hosted by Dan Romito, this show takes complex energy issues, strips away the agendas, and delivers clear fact-based insights. Whether you're an industry expert or simply looking for a balanced perspective, Petronoia brings clarity to the conversation. Each episode, Dan breaks down key topics, from U.S. energy independence to global policy impacts, focusing on the facts rather than the rhetoric, helping listeners make sense of the energy landscape. This is Petronoia, where we separate fact from fiction to fuel-informed discussions.
Welcome to Petronoia. I'm your host, Dan Romito. I'm pumped to have this guest. I think I met Bob, I want to say like 2 years ago, and I heard him speak on a couple of topics, and as he'll probably allude to, immediately I knew that I was a kindred spirit with this guy. His background is fascinating, but before I do it a disservice, Bob, can you just briefly give an intro as to what your experience has been and how you got to where you are now?
Sure. Thank you, Dan. Let me just start by saying it is an honor to be with you. Amongst the guests that you've had are really impressive, and we are indeed kindred spirits because I think we're both in that radical middle and trying to build it. So, I basically started out as a lawyer. I worked for a firm called Latham & Watkins. I was a litigator. Then I went in-house to a big company that was never going to be taken over called Amoco, and ultimately was taken over by BP. And I spent about 30 years in a career there, a lot of it within the legal department, practicing law. And as we'll talk about, one of the most challenging thing in my career that brought me later as the chief environmental lawyer during the Gulf oil spill. But I also had roles within compliance. I had two different stints early in my career where they dipped me, and then later in my career within the public affairs organization, because I have a love for politics and a belief in the possibility of building bridges and solving problems through policy. At the end of my career, I retired from BP at the end of 2020. I was the vice president and head of regulatory affairs and policy across the Obama administration, the first Trump administration, and then Biden. And now in my post BP career, I'm hesitating to say retirement anymore. I'm very busy working on many of the same issues that I did at BP. I'll put them into maybe three buckets. One is working with a number of different universities that are working on the problems of energy decarbonization and particularly methane emissions, how we deal with those. So I work with a roundtable that Harvard convenes with folks from companies and NGOs and technologists that deal with that issue. I work with the University of Texas, Colorado State, Colorado School of Mines on something called the Energy Emissions Modeling and Data Lab, which is the science and technology and tools for actually measuring these emissions, which obviously is critical. I also am a senior fellow with Duke Nicholas Institute and work with them on their decarbonization pathways projects as to the U.S. So that's kind of the university side. I also work with a coalition called the Natural Gas Innovation Network, based here in Washington, Engine. And that is a group of companies that are working on input to policymakers on how we get differentiated gas, how we create standards that will work for actually, verifying emissions transparently, and then also just leveraging all this innovation that we've had. So that's kind of the advocacy government affairs side. And then I also work on just a lot of bridge building work, and all of this is bridge building work. But I'm a senior fellow with an organization, nonprofit called Future 500, which brings together diverse stakeholders from activists, even on the farther left, to companies and those in the middle, or really good dialogues, the kind of dialogues you talk about in your book, which I hope we'll plug here. But they very much curate those dialogues. And the last thing, I do have one private client I work with called Insight M, and the M stands for methane. And they are, as you know, because I think I also saw you recently at one of their events, right. They are a leading provider of these aerial methane detection techniques, which are scaling up and can be done affordably to not only find the emissions and drive them down, but also find that product that people are losing. So So I advise them as well. So I think that's almost everything, but a lot all related to common themes.
So you go through the ringer with BP for the better part of a decade, come out, and then you decide to take on 4 jobs as opposed to just one job. That a boy. So bringing it back, when we had this conversation, I think we were in Denver, right? It was in Denver, and we were sitting next to each other, and we're going through your experience with BP. And I remember you gave me like a look where I asked you if you got to meet Marky Mark, and you're like, no, I did not. And then I find myself in the same situation because my big thing is like, I love my boots and I love my Jordans. And when I'm obviously wearing a suit or dressed up, I wear boots. And when I'm in New York or out West, everyone asks me if I watched Landman. I'm like, I haven't seen it yet. So I feel your pain, and I feel equally as dumb for asking, do you know Marky Mark? But your time with the Deepwater Horizon experience, just walk me through that soup to nuts on like, what was that like? I mean, we've seen the movie, we've heard about it. Obviously it was in the news for years, but you were the guy in the middle dealing with it every single day for what, 7 years, 6, 7 years? Is that?
Yeah, I was, let's say 5 years in 10.
5 years. So the better part of half a decade, like walk me through that experience, man. Like that is so unique and so interesting. I'm sure there's some horror stories built into that.
Yeah. I mean, well, and the horror story part of it is, and whenever I'm asked this and I go back to those moments, it was a horrific tragedy. I mean, number of families lost fathers, and it was a horrible tragedy. And I remember my first involvement. I was then living in Houston. I just moved from Chicago, where I'd lived for many years, and I was in Houston. And in the middle of the night, I got a phone call, and it was from the secretary to the general counsel, telling me that this incident had happened in the Gulf. We didn't know a lot then, and from that moment, like for all those years, it was what I woke up with and went to bed with every night. Because BP had prior serious safety situations, notably the Texas City refinery explosion a number of years before, and I came into my role as the head of environmental and legal safety, environmental safety and illegal and environmental health and safety. I was part of the response to that, and many of us who'd been through that, because we said never again would anything like that ever happen. Now this is upstream, not downstream. But we thought, my God, what do we do? Can the company survive? Literally. And there was a time not long after that, and I think Bob Dudley, our CEO then, told this story. He was just a hero to all of us. Said, that the credit default swap markets were betting that we were going to go under. When you have an incident of that scope and scale with all of the different dimensions, I was sitting and advising on the legal dimensions, but I also was very involved with our Washington team, and I had a lawyer in D.C., and then actually several we hired to work on the combined legal and congressional and government affairs and all of those things. It's just unlike anything else. It's orders of magnitude more complicated. The other thing is, and I remember also sitting in the Houston Crisis Center when the rig went down and seeing that happen, and our hearts sinking, along with it. It was a very intense, and many of us knew, some of the guys who were on the rig or family members, so the connections. It was a massive tragedy. Out of that came a very, very clear understanding and commitment across the company that everything had to focus on responding, stopping the ongoing spill, and that took some time, making recompense to the people who were affected and making sure we figured out exactly what happened so it could never happen again.
Yeah.
I was involved on the legal liability side. Of course, the legal liabilities were in the multi-billions. We knew from the beginning. We had to get used to talking about billions instead of millions all the time. Really. But to give you an example of how thorough that commitment was, I remember hearing from our CEO then, so we're going to do a full root cause investigation of what went wrong. Of course we are. And we're not going to do it under privilege. It's going to be open. And, as a lawyer, you're thinking, oh, okay, the biggest liability in history,
Right.
That's your company case, and you're going to do a public, but it was the right thing to do. And my point in saying all of this is when that something of this scope and scale happens, you have to immediately realize that everything has to focus on restoring public trust, fixing the problem, making sure it never happens again, and you manage the other issues around that central goal rather than starting from, okay, because it would have been myopic to do this, starting from, well, our main goal is to make sure we pay the absolute least, right?
Right.
And we had to lean into cooperation, and we did. And I've written about this a little bit recently. I was really, really heartened, Dan, by the willingness in really tough times for people within the government agencies that were responding to collaborate with us, right? So we, in my group, and I was part of this, did the first ever $1 billion agreement to start restoring the natural resources. Usually that's in litigation down the line. We agreed to do that. Sure. Ken Salazar from Interior was saying we have our boot on their neck. He had to say that.
Yeah, there's optics publicly that you just have to go through, I would imagine.
Yeah. But it was it was a intense time, but also it was the greatest professional challenge of my career. I learned from it, and I honestly, I feel still, upset about what happened. And when you ask me about it, and I go back to that moment, I remember that deeply. But I also am proud of the way our company responded, to right the ship, to find out what went wrong, to do the right thing, and the way, at least in my experience with the agencies and people I was working with, they were willing to work alongside us.
How much longer did you stay at BP post Deepwater?
It was about 6 years, and it was 10 years actually after the incident. But I mean, if you want, the interesting thing, because they're related. So what happened was, I had been working very closely with the head of government affairs for the U.S., and later he became public and government affairs for the globe, for the whole BP organization. His name was Jeff Morrell, former press secretary for the Pentagon.
That's right. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Just amazing. And he came in after the spill, during the response to the spill, and he was pushing a much more proactive engagement, and sometimes pretty, proactively, strongly defending the company and what we were doing and telling our story. And sometimes making the lawyers go, I don't know, do we really want to be that out there? And I think he recognized me as a lawyer who believed in advocacy and believed in communication. And so we were working alongside each other and briefing the board and working together. And he came to me toward the end, recognizing that I'd been working with a lot of officials in the Obama administration and built relationships. I'd spent a lot of time in Washington, and said, look, I've just taken over, this U.S. government affairs, and I think we need a regulatory affairs shop that is as high profile and proactive as our congressional affairs shop. Because in a lot of government affairs groups, regulatory affairs can be a little bit of sleepy, technical, but he wanted us because he said so much of our risk and the impact on our business and even opportunity is in the regulatory space. And regulatory, Bob, would you advise me on how to create an organization. And then he invited me to come in, and it's one of the best decisions I've ever made because A, getting to work with Jeff and an incredible team, B, then move from this relationship with the government, which was on the enforcement side and so on, to one of proactively now engaging on public policy, and which has always been a love of mine. So I did that until I retired at the end of term.
And then, no, that's amazing. And then in terms of like post BP, what's Morel doing today? Do you know?
He is doing a variety of different projects. I think he's, I'll think of the name of the advisory. He's working with a really top flight advisory firm. The name is, I'm not thinking of it the second. I'll probably think of it in there.
That's okay. And then for you personally, like you go through this Deepwater experience, it's on the news every single day. Like in terms of just like career development, and you don't have to get too personal, but in terms of like just your career, was there anything in particular that just fundamentally shifted the way that you look at the world, or it's like pre-BP and post-BP? What were some of the primary differences or the distinct differences in just how you viewed the world?
Oh, you mean before or after I went into BP?
Yeah.
I mean, a big difference obviously was I started out in big law, as a associate and partner in litigation with Laidman Watkins in Chicago. One big difference, and this was my decision to sort of go in-house, is that I wanted to be closer to the business and kind of working alongside a particular business. One of the reasons I made the change is I'd had an experience where I served as sort of the seconded, they call it, the temporary general counsel for one of our clients, which was a subsidiary of Nissan, and I really liked working with them day to day. So I really like solving problems. I also still love advocacy, and that's what litigation was. But as I found, whether it was in legal with in-house or ultimately, especially dealing with public and government affairs, I was doing that kind of advocacy. One thing I would say that is similar when I talk about solving problems is even when I was in big law, I had cases that went to trial, and I loved doing trial and, advocacy and argument. Yes. Mm-hmm. The vast majority of those cases, there's so much at stake that they settle, right? So from the beginning, you are positioning the case through your advocacy, but also maintaining a relationship with the other side, even though you're crossing swords all the time, so that when the time comes, I remember I won a big case one time, and the senior partner came in and said, "Okay, really great, congratulations. Now's the time to go settle the case." I'm like, what? I just kicked their butt. But the thread I want to draw with that is in all of these things, it's about, as you're working, even within conflict, looking for commonalities and way to solve problems. So that's what happened then when I came into BP. It's a massive organization. I thought when I was in big law, it was big, but there's another thing, Dan, just working with an organization of this scope and scale, the importance of collaboration with everybody. I've fortunately got a stint in London, so I understood how things worked at the center. I understood the culture better in the UK, and I built relationships then I was able to use over time. So very different, but as probably the last thing I'll say here, and just as your question is, there are these threads that run through my career, but I don't think I could have planned it that way. I think of it more, to mix a metaphor, as planting seeds. Like I'm interested in this, and here comes this opportunity. Well, like I would never have gotten the big job I did in DC had I been an external applicant for that job, because they would have wanted to hire somebody who already done it.
Right.
But I had planted seeds. They had seen me operate in these scenarios, and they trusted me because of my experience here. So I got that kind of job, and that was kind of the course of my career.
Yeah, the point of collaboration is super interesting. We just had Judith Curry on, and she was fascinating to talk to. She is one of the authors that just wrote the updated DOE report that was utilized for the endangerment finding.
Yes.
And, I wanted to reach out to her for a couple different reasons. Number one, half the stuff that was written in the DOE report, I didn't necessarily understand to the extent that I should. And I was like, I'll just ask the author. The other thing is, you kind of just do your internet creeping. And, there's a lot of discussion and work about her time at Georgia Tech, and she was ousted for, as she would put it, being a climate denier. But then you actually get to talk to her, and she's not actually denying anything regarding the climate. Her central argument is we should place less emphasis on why this came to be, right? She is not arguing that sea levels are not rising. She says, yeah, they're rising. She's not saying that San Francisco is not sinking. She's not saying that there's less powerful hurricanes. She's saying that we're so caught up on the emotional aspect of what's driving this that we're losing focus on implementing more resilient and adaptive technologies. And she makes that very, very clear. Now, in her writing, I'll be a little bit critical of it. It doesn't necessarily come out that way. But when she explains how she thinks, it's very evident that she's very pro-resiliency and pro-adaptation, and takes into account, maybe it's because we're both U of C alums, like the Milton Friedman model of economics. Like, she is very in tune with, hey, like, regulation doesn't necessarily solve problems. Taxes are, a whole nother issue that can't tax your way into a solution. And she talks about, hey, seawalls make a lot of sense. Like, maybe we don't go solar, maybe we spend that money on seawalls. Anyway, one of the frustrations that she has, and frankly, I have this frustration as well, is this lack of collaboration. And you do a really good job. Like, one of the reasons I really enjoy talking to you is you sort of crack the code, right? You're like, you have the rubric for bringing far left, far right, middle, like undetermined, whatever it may be. And then you can sort of navigate that room, and no one's losing their mind, and no one's throwing punches, and everyone's seeing pretty cordial. Like, the future of engagement, right? This is something that you talk about a lot, and this is a perspective I really do appreciate. In today's climate, I don't want to say hysteria, because then I'm playing into like them, but climate-focused environment, the stakeholder engagement has evolved in a very specific manner, and I think you're leading the charge on that. Like, how have you seen that evolve, and where do you think it's going?
Yeah.
And by the way, I understand I just packed a ton to that question.
No, it's okay. Yeah, objection, compound question. I'll go.
There we go.
Litigator mode. No, I think it's a deep question. So first of all, I couldn't agree more how critical it is. And one reflection I have in terms of how it's evolved is we have an almost bizarre contrast right now between how absolutely polarized things are on energy, climate concerns on the one side, and and frankly now on the other side, pushing back. I'm not talking about the scientists, because the scientists can talk amongst each other. They may disagree on the exact magnitude of the risk, but most all of them are going to say, yes, climate change is a real thing. But we're pulled. All the public dialogue that you see and the politics are pulled to the extremes. The contrast I want to draw, though, is, and I'm in so many of these conversations and have been over the years, in a sense, when you talk to people, be they center left, center right, be they companies, be they most of the environmental groups and so on, I see more seeds of consensus on that we have an issue, that we have an energy trilemma.
Yeah.
We need reliability and security, we need affordability, and we need lower emissions. And even an understanding, because I know many who are in the environmental community, Dan, who come from a background like yours. I mean, they studied economics. I mean, so they understand that you have to have affordability, and you have to, so we have to find a way. And I see in the conversations I have in so many places outside of the big public spats, I see so much consensus. So this idea of how does the radical middle, like you call it, how do we come together so that we can actually have policy and the political environment reflect that in a time when the big meta trends are all, and social media are trying to pull us apart. Okay. But I see a lot of potential. And I did start seeing that when I was working within BP.
Okay.
Another thing I want to say is this kind of has to happen at retail, meaning you have to sit down individually. And in your book, I don't mean keep plugging your book, but just look, you actually walk through how you have a question that starts from curiosity when you're talking to a company or an environment group or whatever. And in some senses, it's so simple and obvious. Like, let's say you went to a family event and you're talking to somebody you love and they come from a very different place. You don't want to just absent yourself. Sometimes you might, but let's say you don't. So how do you talk to them? Right. And it's that kind of thing. But there's a lot of opportunity for that. I sometimes call this, when it happens, like I will stop and say, you realize, and I don't mean this in a religious sense, but we're in a sacred place when that happens. And so I have done that. When I was with BP, I worked, here's an example. I like to tell the story of my good friend, still good friend, Ben Ratner, who you may have met with JP Morgan Chase. And Ben was at the Environmental Defense Fund, and I worked with him across 3 different administrations on methane policy.
Yeah.
I like to joke for BP, when we were talking to the Obama administration about methane policy, it was like, yeah, we do think you need some regulation, but have it be consistent. We only want one agency. We don't want multiple.
Right.
And have it be flexible so we could use new technologies. And Ben and I, on that last point, we're going in together to say, hey, let's be sure people can start using these new technologies, which since then have scaled up even more.
Yeah.
During the Trump administration, honestly, the first one, I was going in saying, well, don't completely get rid of all the regulation.
Yeah.
We need a base of regulation, but it needs to be flexible. And so, there's a consistency there. And I make that point because the debates drag us into this idea of we should have complete deregulation on the one side, or we're going to regulate ourselves fully out of the problem by defining every problem and having something in the CFR code that tells you what you got to do. And those extreme, neither of them make it easy.
The interpretation of deregulation is something that's really frustrating to me because in some cases, not all, but enough, there's the interpretation that deregulation means put more bourbon into the punch bowl, right? Take your foot off the gas and all this stuff, quote unquote, is going away. And, what I've been trying to convey many times, and I think the message is starting to get through, it's deregulation is more synonymous with cost of compliance, right? We want to lower the cost of compliance. Like 2 things can be true at once. You can lower the cost of compliance and you can improve best practices. And I actually think maybe I'm going to get a call from Chris Wright and Lee Zeldin. I'll have them on the show. I think what Zeldin in particular is trying to convey is he is begging the industry to improve best practices and adopt more innovative technologies because he wants to showcase to the world that you don't need this overburdensome bill. When I mean bill, I mean like cost.
Yeah.
Not literal bill to ensure that people are doing like quote unquote the right thing. And this is like the window of opportunity for the industry to be proactive as opposed to traditionally reactive and say, look at how much progress and trend and innovation we are accomplishing with this sort of more flexible environment. And once again, I think the majority of people are getting that. Certainly the majors are getting that. I think the struggle is more on the private side and the smaller operator. But the notion, back to your point on engagement, like it is very Bloods versus Crips. You know what I'm saying? Like, and I'm guilty of this too. Like sometimes I'll read something and I'm like, what the hell is this guy talking about? And, you know, kudos, and you bring him up, kudos to Ratner. Like, I think he's in the same category as yourself, where he's just a normal dude and you can talk to him and it's reasonable and you're not going to strangle each other, and he'll actually hear you out, and you'll definitely disagree. Like, certainly we don't agree on everything, but where I really value his perspective is just remaining pragmatic. But I think a lot of the fault, if we're being honest, is on the industry, because we allowed ourselves to be backed into a corner and then probably waited too long to convey what economic reality actually entailed. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, I think as people often say, there's blame on all sides of this, right? I mean, industry knows the problems and the solutions, and we have all the great engineers who know how to do it best, and we're frustrated. Nobody understands this. One of the things that I was fighting, I used to call it the Eeyore complex. They don't understand us.
Right.
It's very easy to get into that. And when you feel like you're under assault, that's, you know, it's easy to get into that mode. But actually, I think that's right. And we're also not good at branding. Yeah. You know, fracking is fracking. Well, you know, that word, that wouldn't be the best one. So there are so many examples where we're not good at that. And the other thing that happens is, and I kind of understand this. So a lot of people in industry are fearful of taking that step forward to talk to an activist or an environmental group because they don't understand me, they're angry at me, and I'm only going to get myself in trouble.
Right. They want to bankrupt me.
Potentially legal trouble or whatever, right? But I believe, you know, first of all, silence is its own form of speech. So if you're not reaching out and having those conversations, there's no chance of finding the common ground. And often when you do, I have found there's more common ground than right. I mean, to give you one example, now this is one where BP was leaning in a bit when I was in my role as head of regulatory affairs and policy, but we were advocates of carbon pricing. Our view was price the externality, start at a low amount so it's not going to have a bad impact on the economy, and rank it up over, and then let industry innovate around it, okay? Right. I'm not saying that's not very popular these days. There are many different forms that can take, by the way, because climate trade policy also could be a form of a price, and then you create carbon clubs. I could go a lot down that. But my point is we were advocating for that. But we opposed this initiative in the state of Washington that was very poorly designed, right? Yeah. It was riddled with exceptions or whatever, and the environmental groups were all really mad at us, and we were hearing from all of our, colleagues in the academic and other communities, that, you're not true to your word.
Right.
Well, but then we went in and said, we want to the governor's office and others in that state said, and the environmental groups. And we said, we actually want some form of this, but it needs to be well designed. Can we work with you? Oh, and by the way, the first one was by a public referendum, which is often not a good way to make that. Not where we said, hey, we want to work with you. And we did. And then we were sitting down, and I was part of this with a whole range of environmental groups. And now we're planning how we're going to push back on those who are and it was very funny. I remember one of the people said to me at one time, Bob, I really like you and I really like working with you. But of course, on this other issue, my organization is going to continue to criticize you. I'm like, yeah, of course, and that's okay. So and let me make one other point. I find it very helpful, Dan, and especially and I still view myself as part of the industry to a certain sense, not like before, but like I believe very strongly in taking an ecosystem approach to this, which means when I hear somebody, an environmental activist, who's taking a really, really, what I view as an unrealistic or very, very strong position, one of the things I say to myself is, one, I look at their heart and I say, this is somebody who cares about something. That's a good thing. As a human, I should care about that. And secondly, I may not want that person. I may not think that's the best person to decide the practical way forward.
Yeah.
But if they're saying, hey, wake up, we have an issue, we need that in the ecosystem, right?
Yeah.
I might disagree with that. So I try to be charitable and understanding of the different views, not come at it like us versus them. And if you do that, I had so many experiences where I could find you could have an actual dialogue. Now, we may not agree on the solutions and we may debate on them, but there is more common ground than you think when you do that. And you build trust, you build understanding and knowledge of how folks who may be opposing you view the world. And I just think it's a smart thing to do.
There is a real example of that, like Eric Beltz. He's running the show at Engine Number One. We had him on, and listening to Engine Number One's thesis is just fascinating. So in a quick 2 minutes, I'm going to paraphrase everything, and he'll probably call me because I butchered it. Everyone usually
it too. It was great.
He's dude, super smart. But when in oil and gas, when you typically say the name Engine Number One, people immediately, 9 times out of 10, Exxon shareholder activists. And I think the frustration that Engine Number One has was they didn't go in guns blazing, so to speak, because Exxon's ESG program wasn't top notch. They went in because Exxon at that time had struggled to offer competitive returns. And they saw that there were material aspects of their sustainability program that just weren't up to par. Now, once again, sustainability isn't the magic bullet to immediately generate returns. But it does operate as a proxy for how innovative and forward-thinking, in my opinion, you are. Why I think that's so relevant is with the tech bros and the future prowess of the U.S. economy relying almost entirely on data centers. One of the things that I don't think is being discussed enough, because there's this existing euphoria, I understand why, associated with data centers, but we are not discussing to the extent that we should their impact on waste, water, and emissions. We've had this trend in the United States for the last 40 years of declining emissions. We've had this trend in the United States with pretty consistent water stewardship. There's some improvements to be had. And then with waste, I think we actually do a pretty good job. Like, there's always room for improvement, but we've done a pretty good job. Enter the data center. You're talking about the average hyperscale data center for Google is sucking up 164 million gallons of water per year. You extrapolate that out to, 2,000-3,000 hyperscale data centers by the end of the decade. You're talking about close to 500,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools of water used on an annual basis. You talk about scaling out nuclear. Then you bring in, and you're the lawyer, you're bringing into eminent domains, blue state, red state, all these other legislative constraints, resource management. So, like, my point in saying that is, I think there's a regulatory scenario where regulation comes into play, not because of anything related to, as I put it, environmental Jesus, and I'm being a little bit sarcastic with that term, but resource management. Like, there's not an infinite amount of resources in place. And if these companies are behind the ball in adopting these technologies that make them more efficient, and then simultaneously provide data to showcase their efficiencies, we could easily find ourselves in a position where companies are being penalized because they're not going to have access to resources, or they're going to be penalized because they're misusing or have the perception of misusing resources. And we're getting to see this with some of the NIMBYism on the data center front. Why I bring that up is your partnerships with the universities, my understanding is there's a lot of academic work associated with the impact of this. But there's also critiques on like the university system is probably not as fair or as objective as it relates to the oil and gas space as they should be. Like, can you just set the record straight on what you're observing with these university partnerships and how they're playing out and what they're focusing on, especially as it relates to the intersection between, let's call it agriculture / land management, energy and power, and then the tech bros?
Yeah. Wow. That's a lot of topics.
Yeah, I just burned a lot of calories with that question, man. Sorry. I didn't mean to make you sweat in that nice suit.
No, I believe me, I never sweat. First off, I think this is sort of a university specific thing, meaning different universities are more sort of traditional academic and focused on that, versus a number of universities are also working very closely with industrial partners or collaborators or whatever. And we can get into later, if you want, this whole issue of are they co-opted and so on.
Yeah.
My view is, I mean, gosh, when you work with top academics, I mean, I think about people like Dave Allen and Arvind Ravi Kumar and Aaron Tullis and others at the University of Texas at Austin.
Yes.
These are brilliant people who are very strong-minded. So I'm never worried that they're going to cut corners for anybody and they're going to stand up for science and what's right. But there are also people, and actually Erin worked for ExxonMobil, so she comes from a background in industry, but they've worked closely with industry, so they understand how the kit works, what the issues are, what the challenges are, yes, where the bodies are buried, all of that. And so the work that they do is very much focused on that, even as it also relies upon the traditional scientific method, and it's very punctilious about how it's done and peer review and all of that. So I actually think a number of I'm just mentioning them because I work closely with them.
Right.
Of course, there are people at Stanford, there are people, Rice University, of course, who, many of these different universities, certainly Colorado State and Mines, they're very tied in. I mean, Colorado State has this wonderful facility where people test all of their different detection methods and stuff. So my point there is there's a great opportunity for collaboration and for them to do that. And I think, but they will be able to identify these problems early, and the good ones. Let me mention Duke here too, because Nicholas Institute, and this is the idea of cross-functional, cross-disciplinary.
Yeah.
Harvard does that well too in my work with them. But that's what we need, is a cross-disciplinary approach to solve these problems.
Can I give a real life example of that? Just real quick. Like this will knock your socks off. I apologize for cutting you off, but
no.
It's trigger. One of my good friends, I've come to know this guy, Jim Blackburn. He used to run B Carbon. I think the world of the guy. When I first met him, he lovingly and respectfully went out of his way to tell me that he's sued every one of my clients. like I've sued them all.
Oh yes, I know. I think I know. Yeah, I know.
Yeah, but he and I've had him on the podcast too, and he's just interesting and smart and very good at just analyzing everything around him. And what I thought was hilarious was he had me speak to a group of environmentalists. He's like, they have to hear what you have to say. I'm like, Jim, I feel like I'm going to walk in this room and I'm going to be like dodging and weaving, and like maybe I'm not going to walk out. I'm going to walk out with like a black eye or something. He's like, no, it'll be fine. And so the point of that meeting was to showcase why you need to prioritize economics and return and cash flow over the environment, right? You can have environmental stewardship if you have all the financials in place. You can't have environmental stewardship if you do not have the financials in place. Case in point, why do developed countries like the United States and the UK, I'm going to leave Germany out of this, but why do developed economies typically have decarbonizing trends or trends of decarbonization and growing economies, and why do developing economies, why don't they? Anyway, and so at the end of the speech, people were actually really, really cool. So kind of to your point too, like, hey, like put your guard down slightly, like don't go in guns blazing and be objective in the analysis. But one of the questions was, why does ROI matter so much? And when the first reaction in my mind was like, is this like, are you shitting me? Like, is that a real question? But this person was an environmental science who had studied soil for like 20 years, no capital markets experience, nor should they have, no exposure to banking, no exposure to anything regarding finances. And that was sort of like this inflection point. And I think Jim did it on purpose, right? He was like this secret genius to like get me to understand the other perspective. And it was actually one of the motivating features when I wrote the book of all those questions. But then we had this dialogue regarding, well, like, here's why you need return. Like an investor gives you money, you do what you say with that, but his expectation is that he gets a return. So if you're going to employ these technologies to mitigate, climate or soil or ag or methane, whatever it may be, whatever the goal is, you're not going to attain it if you are cut off from capital. And the way that you get cut off from capital the quickest is you don't offer a return. You would have thought I walked on water. Like people were like that was the aha moment for them. And that was, once again, an inflection point for me where I was like, ignorant. It was ignorant of me, of course, but I was like, how the hell do you not know this? But then I was like, well, why the hell should they know it? Right. Like I know nothing about soil. If they got into the science of like CO2 or the specifics of methane, I would look like the world's biggest idiot. And so I think that's just a real life example of what you were saying. And then that playing out in the university system, back to like your notion of cross-functional, right? You can't have the echo chamber. One of my biggest frustrations is the echo chamber in oil and gas. Like, dude, everyone's kids are on the same baseball team. Everyone lives in the same neighborhood. You're not going to get, you're not going to go out of your way in most cases to like say maybe everything that's on your mind. And like people like yourself, where it's like a little bit of Houston, a sprinkle of Chicago, like what's going on in DC. Like I'm very similar, right? I went to grade, middle, and junior high in Texas, and then I finished high school in Chicago, like two completely different worlds. NASDAQ, I spent time in London, Stockholm, Frankfurt. I remember them being like, God, this rowdy American, because he complains about not having air conditioning in the office in Frankfurt. And I just couldn't understand. I'm like, how do y'all work in this? This is ridiculous. Like crank up the AC. But once again, very long-winded way. Do you think the university thing is improving that dynamic, or how you see it play out?
There are certainly best practices, but we have been through, the universities have been subject to the same pressures of everybody else, and that is to pull us apart. So the universities who have, and particular individuals who have made it a point to collaborate and work with industry get criticized for being co-opted. And I, having watched that up close with BP, and I stewarded our relationships with Harvard and Tufts on climate policy, and I also worked closely with the scientists and within BP who were managing our climate science program with Princeton. And these were programs that went on for many, many years. And I will tell you that on the inside, and of course this happens in boardrooms and CEO offices and so on, when these academics are invited and are directing, this isn't what you see on television. They're delivering hard messages.
Yeah.
They're making sure that everybody including the regular oil and gas guy who is senior and sitting in a room and still a little bit skeptical about climate change. They're making sure, knowing that person likely is an engineer and is a science-based person, they're making sure they understand how they come to these conclusions and why, for example. And I think that's less of an issue, I think, now in terms of long debates about whether the science is real. And so I'm not saying it's gone completely, but I think most people, certainly within companies, get that. But then it's like, okay, and I remember many such conversations. Guys, fix your methane problem, for God's sake.
Right.
I mean, because if you don't fix it, that you understand that is the chink in the armor. That is the main concern we're hearing from everybody about using natural gas. Right. And that concern is still there. And there are still some people saying, oh, no, it's as bad as coal, et cetera, et cetera. I don't agree with that.
Right.
But it is. Methane is a serious greenhouse gas pollutant, and we can fix it, and we can get more gas to sell, and we can become more efficient. But my point, coming back to the academics, is what I would say to those people who are worried, don't associate with them because you're going to get compromised. Look at the people you're talking about. They're not going to be compromised. Listen to them. And secondly, be careful what you ask for, because if you are severing that connection, those conversations between people who are climate concerned and well-informed, those conversations are going to be harder to have. And it's, after all, a private enterprise society like we are, right? It is the companies that are going to have to do this by dint of regulation, and you can't completely regulate and fix the problem.
Right.
Or they're going to have to do it ultimately.
Yeah.
Innovation.
I was joking, but I was also half serious. Actually, I was serious and half joking. We did this conversation. It was a roundtable. And to your point on methane, it's like, how can you get the biggest dent into the methane problem in the quickest way? And people thought I was being a smartass, but I was being completely serious. I'm like, the company that can prove that they have zero methane leaks without question, right? So the measurement, the verification, quantification, they don't ever have to pay taxes ever again. And people, I'm like, but, and we wrote about this extensively. And this kind of goes back to like the university thing. Like, I see a lot of analysis being done on, just behavioral finance. Like, why do people operate the way that they do, the respective incentive structures that they're presented with? And it's very clear to me. I would love your response to this, because you've been through like all these ordeals. And then I want to get your feelings on sort of like unintended consequences of some of these net zero policies. And this is the bridge to that. But I don't think people, and certainly corporates, like I'm using those interchangeably, and I know in the world of law they're the same thing. I don't think they respond constructively to being told what to do or being burdened with regulation. I think they're much more responsive and certainly more creative and quicker and more efficient when there's a meaningful carrot to go grab, and in a competitive setting, right? May the best man win under these sort of sets of rules, and go figure it out. And if you do, you get X reward. I would much rather see sort of the oversight on methane. And you are aware of a project that we're doing, and I'm observing this right now. Like, if you provide more carrots and ensure that the sort of playing field is fair, and there's a referee to oversee that it remains fair, I think a lot of these things get done in a much quicker and efficient manner.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And you've given me a chance to bring up something I wanted to say earlier, which is moving beyond this vapid debate of zero regulation or solve everything through regulation.
Yeah.
In the middle is a performance standard, right? So, for example, a methane intensity standard, a framework for monitoring, measurement, reporting, and verification of emissions that is broadly accepted across the industry and ultimately globally, because we don't want our adversaries and competitors to be cheating.
Right.
And most of them or many of them aren't even measuring theirs.
True.
So, I mean, there's something that's about American self-interest, by the way.
Yeah.
But setting a performance standard and then having transparency around that standard, and that then allows and incentivizes industry to innovate around that to solve the problem. Because if you go into this and, you kind of make this point in your book, every setting is different. Every state is different. You talk about what worked in Texas may not work, all those kinds of things. So, and it likewise gets down to, in oil and gas, the particular field, what's your kit, and all of that stuff. So if you go in and try to regulate by defining every flange and so on and so forth, it won't work. You cannot get out there and do that. But if you say, hey, we want a methane intensity standard of this, or sometimes it is appropriate to say, I believe this, you're moving into over time the following equipment, maybe that is appropriate. But the fundamental point is, and I also, since you went to USD, I was going to say, and it relates a little bit to this, Cass Sunstein and his book, Nudge.
Yes.
So, and this is something I think policymakers who are concerned about a climate or other issue really need to think about, and that is the real change. If you want to take tons of emissions out of the system, real way to do that is to find, yes, sometimes it's going to be a regulatory tool, but often it's going to be a carrot, and often it's going to be a support for a voluntary program, et cetera, et cetera. There are many different ways.
Yep.
And be agnostic about exactly what the tool is, just as we should be agnostic about energy sources and not overly politicize them.
Yeah.
But look at the problem and then create a performance standard and then hold industry to account through transparency and so on for meeting that. I do believe that there is a place for some regulation in that space.
Yeah.
I do. But you can't, last thing I'm going to say about a performance standard, you also need, and my colleague, Kate Konchnik, who's now working on the Hill for Senator Whitehouse, but she was at Duke and Harvard, and she's done some great work on the issue of how regulation has to incorporate and move and change with technology. It really can't keep up. So you have to find a way to, this is the flexibility point, because otherwise industry will just focus on compliance with what is a very low standard, especially if that's expensive enough.
Right.
And you'll leave on the table. And again, I'm saying this as somebody who's concerned about climate, let's say, you're going to leave a lot of tons of potential emissions reduction at low cost. You're going to take them off the table, because they're going to set money on compliance with things that may not drive the results that you want. That's an unintended consequence.
100%. Like, I'm so glad that you said that, because when people have like this net zero debate, like you have to hear my entire thought, like, because usually people cut me off halfway through. What I say before they cut me off is, I'm like, there's no way the global economy is going to attain net zero organically. It is impossible. It's a pipe dream, in my opinion. But there are ways to implement technologies and financial instruments that facilitate a path towards net zero. Like, you can pursue net zero, you can decarbonize. If the end goal is net zero or bust, I think that's the wrong goal. I think the goal should be to implement technologies and to fund competitive cash flowing return or ROI based investments that put decarbonization paths on steroids. And where I'm going with that is, like we're so caught up in this. If we don't go to net zero, it's this existential threat, and the world's going to implode, and civilization's going to come to an end. Like, it's very fear based. You juxtapose that with, okay, here's this problem, and let's get some really smart people in place and let them figure out, utilizing the principles of the free market, entrepreneurship, giving them free reign with a boundary of rules. So like your point on regulation, like the regulation, in my opinion, is like, here's the rules you have to operate within, and give them a very specific prize, right? And that prize could you get the company bought, you go IPO, you never have to pay taxes. But there's an enthusiasm psychologically. And once again, I've read Nudge, I love it. But Michael Lewis also talks about this in his book about behavioral finance. Like, it's empirically proven, and the science is above my head, nor do I understand it, and I'm paraphrasing, but it's empirically proving that the enthusiasm and the collaboration when you're working towards a goal that you're actually excited about is much more effective and quicker than like, well, if we don't figure this out, we're going to die. Like there's this, like, you operate really tight. You have a different mindset. Like, you're afraid to make a mistake. And then the other one, I'm not saying like it's free reign, but I wish the mentality around decarbonization or net zero wasn't so fear-based, and it was much more like, wow, what an amazing opportunity to implement some really cool technologies. It's like, what came out of World War II, like obviously one of the more depressing instances, but look at all the cool technologies in the industrial boom that we were able to capitalize on, because we were like, hey, we have to figure this out. Not like, oh my God, like the Germans are coming in, like, what do we do? It's like, no, we're gonna kick their ass because we're gonna be innovative and we're gonna figure this out.
I don't know. I think there was a lot of fear in that too. And today we ought to be, in my view, fearful, but also confident of our ability to meet the challenge of China. What China is doing, and I'm not just talking about militarily. I'm talking about the way that they are scaling up technologies of all kinds.
Yeah.
And part of they do that by stealing some of the IP, of course, but they're scaling it up, and it's our challenge to prove that in a free society that we can compete with that. I believe we can. Or I'm going to push back for a second. Maybe Dan, this will illustrate some of the kind of dialogue you're talking about. And I'm going to channel it. This isn't just my perspective, but for a second, I'm going to channel responsible climate advocates, okay? And it has to do with where we are in this conversation. And the part I'm pushing back on is the notion of net zero, because I think I might hold it a little differently than you.
Okay.
The way this started out is, for a very long time, people, and particularly people in industry, were very, very slow to accept the growing science demonstrating that, Houston, we do have a problem. Now, we can debate how much of an emergency it is. We can debate, what the range of uncertainty is, but it seemed pretty clear for a long time.
Yes.
So the environmental community was not just crying wolf, but crying out, and the scientific community saying, hey, guys, wake up.
Yeah.
We have an issue, and we need to get at it. And we waited a long time debating about whether we had an issue. And then as consensus built on having an issue, there was also a long time when people were but we don't need to do anything about it. It's like opposing any kind of climate action, and opposing any effort to set any objectives to try to get there. And if you're from the business community, you got to set an objective, and sometimes you got to set a stretch goal. Okay. And sometimes we do this in business all the time for breakthroughs, right? You set a moonshot objective, and you were talking about World War II. I was going to come back to Kennedy. Yeah. It was a pretty simple idea to say that we were going to go to the moon, right? Like,
yeah.
Well, how are we going to do that?
Like, right? Where are we going?
Right. And so to me, So the next phase was the environmental community saying, guys, we have a problem here.
Yeah.
And we need to think about how we can manage our current energy system transitioning over time to one that is lower emissions. Now, it's wrong to say, in my view, and fanciful to say, okay, well, we have an emergency, so tomorrow we're going to go off fossil fuels. That is impossible,
Right.
and it's not wise, and I understand that criticism and identify with it, but it's also reasonable to say, but you can't just be unmitigated fossil fuels without any emissions controls forever either, right? It's got to be something in between. But the push was then, Dan, to set up some reasonable ambitions for companies, for countries, and the world to reach. And that was the idea of net zero. Exactly when we can reach that or whatever, or treating that as a talisman that says, oh, net zero, and not paying attention to growing energy demand, that is fanciful. But I believe, the science is real. I believe we do need to set some ambitions. And then, and this is the common ground, then it's let's talk about what are the practical ways we can do this, balancing the energy trilemma. And that's where I see the opportunity set.
So I agree with everything you said. I think the only thing I would add to that is the difference, in my opinion, of going to the moon or World War II is that was very country specific, right? That was, hey, we are the United States. We're the biggest badasses on the playground. We're going to the moon. Like, we're doing it. It's funny you should say that because I remember my dad telling me a story about like my grandpa being like, we're going where? Like, what the hell? Like, we're going to the effing moon? Like, what? Like,
Why would we do that?
like, what? Why? Anyway, the difference with the net zero dynamic, in my opinion, is that it's global. And as cynical as it sounds, I don't think there's a scenario that ever emerges where China, India, Russia, Venezuela, Iran, Iraq, maybe some other players will say, you know what, we're going to transition our strategy, and we're going to focus more on the net zero policy. So in other words, China in particular is just going to do whatever they're going to do. And statistically, the United States now accounts, I think, for 15% of global emissions. I think China is like 35%. So I don't want us to fall into this trap where we are spending money foolishly, like if there's a return to be had, if there's efficiency in place. But I don't want us spending money in a manner to where if the goal is global net zero, we always have this behemoth in the form of China and India that are just not going to do it. And we end up what Europe, right? There's this fascinating, I think it's a meme, but it shows like the emissions of Germany and the UK, and then the GDP of Germany and UK, and then with China. And it's like, hey, good job, Europe. Thanks for going green, and it's this juxtaposition with the thing. But I also think, the world is moving. I mean, here's where I'm going to contradict myself slightly. The world is moving in an opposite direction than the United States in terms of emissions management, right? You have Southeast Asia, South Korea, EU. And so if Trump is going to establish the United States as this energy powerhouse globally, there are some concessions. It can't be take it or leave it. Like, there has to be some concessions. And I do think those concessions are in like, hey, not only can we provide you this affordably and reliably, like to your point, we also have the lowest carbon intense molecule. Like, we can do that. And so I'm splitting hairs a little bit.
Can I say something about that? Because I don't think you're splitting hairs. I think you just offer the synthesis that was going to be my response to this, because I couldn't agree more that the main point is not just reducing U.S. emissions, okay? Yeah. And that's important to remember. This is a global problem. But where I think people miss the boat is I see opportunity in that. So it isn't just we're developing these technologies so the U.S. can use it, although we can, and we can produce the lowest carbon molecules from the Gulf of Mexico, the lowest methane. We can do that and leverage that, but we also are developing in our open society with our ability to innovate the most innovative technologies to do this. We can win in this. So rather than saying, oh no, we're so upset, Europe is demanding this or that, we'll see that and we'll beat you in that. We can leverage that from an American perspective. And you sort of get to this later in your book. And the other thing is there's power in our collaboration, in our relationships with these other democracies where we can work together. And by the other, our manufacturing in many areas, our steel, I mean, it's the lowest emissions in the world. We ought to be leveraging that advantage and sharing that with others. And that's where the possibility of climate trade policy comes in. Okay. Senator Cassidy's Foreign Pollution Fee Act. Now, you can argue whether that's exactly the right policy. I think it's a pretty smart one. Yeah. It hits the point that this is a way actually we compete and win in the world. And it's an essential way, in my view, to confront China.
To your point on like China being an adversary, it's like, how do you box in China? Like the tariff thing, I don't like tariffs. Like I'm a Trump fan. I don't like tariffs, probably the way that I was brought up, just
me too,
academically. But if you really want to box them in, what is China terrible at? Emissions management. What is the world concerned about? Emissions management.
Bingo.
Well, we can box them in through a variation of what Cassidy's trying to do, right? And then, no, I love it. So there you go. Case in point, collaboration. In terms of like, I can't believe we've been talking for.
I know it's
it's 10 minutes. Once again, I really appreciate the time, man. This is exactly what I was hoping to get out of this. If you were to sum up where we're going or what you'd want to see happen in like a couple bullets, like what's the crystal ball of one Bobby Lee Stout?
So the first bullet is, let's focus on the prize here, meaning the prize of what we can contribute to our own economy and globally in energy. I mean, energy, not only economically, but as a geopolitical force. So that is a prize. And at the same time, as I said, because we have this within our capability, to have it be reliable, affordable, and lower in emissions. That is a prize for us, and it's all pieces of that together. And that, if you recognize that trilemma, that opens up the second bullet point, which is deep and continuous collaboration toward crafting and implementing those solutions. And that happens to all the various pieces we talked about. But let me give you an example, because I think one of the questions you were going to ask me about, how will I know things are working or whatever? We have an enormous opportunity and challenge before us when it comes to permitting reform. Okay.
Yeah.
Our whole, and that's, there are many pieces of that. There's state and federal, there's NEPA, there's many aspects. But the point is, whether you're Ezra Klein writing about abundance, or you're somebody on the center right saying government's got to get out of the way of us innovating, right? Whether you are a believer in renewables, and I think we need all these different forms of energy, or you're a believer in fossil fuels, we need more pipe, all those things. Permitting reform is essential. We do need to protect our environment. You talked earlier about the issues that come up with data centers. That's real. Our ability to come up with a smart way to do this that gets to a decision, even if some cases it's right, this is not the right project, so we're not approving, that's fine, but gets to decision so companies and governments can invest. If we can do that and have the conversations that lead to a bipartisan answer, an enduring solution to that problem, that will be amazing. And if we just devolve and continue in our extreme spaces fighting about it, then it's going to really be a drag on our economy and our future.
Yeah. Well said, my friend. I love it. Thank you so much for the time. This was great. I know everyone's going to get out of it a lot. And then in terms of what you're working on now, is there anything that you want to plug or anything?
Well, the thing I would plug, because we talked a little bit about methane, but the work I'm doing now with the natural gas innovation network, and I know you're doing some work also with respect to abandoned wells and so on. I think and this drive toward transparency, we can't solve our energy challenges or our emissions challenges in that trilemma without good data. And that sounds boring, but that transparency, and getting and then understanding. The last thing I want to plug here is so let's talk to the current administration or even the current Congress, and there are those let's find a way for America to continue to lead in this area. Let's not throw all that aside. Let's lead in this area in a way that's smart for energy and also smart for addressing emissions in the world. I mean, to me, that's the smart way forward, and that's what I'm really spending a lot of my time.